On this video, we're going to be looking at how the government sets price floors from time to time. It's going to cover both aspects of theme one, but we're also going to dip into labour markets when we look at things like the national minimum wage, which we'll be starting with. Well, the national minimum wage was introduced primarily to improve the standards of living of poor people. It's statutory, that means it's backed up by law, so firms who don't do it can be fined. It was introduced at a level of £3.60 an hour for most people in 1999 and currently sits again for most people at £8.72 an hour. Younger people get less than this for reasons that we're going to touch upon a bit later. And one question that comes from this is, should the minimum wage be a regional one rather than a national one? It's something that examiners sometimes are asked to set because, for example, the cost of living in London is higher than the cost of living in, say, the northeast of England. So how can we draw this via a lovely diagram? Well, the labour market, like any other market, has an upward sloping supply curve because workers love high wages, and a downward sloping demand curve because firms don't like paying high wages. We'll have an equilibrium wage of WE, and that will result in QE people being employed at that wage. However, the government feels that this wage is too low. So it sets a price floor, the national minimum wage, above the equilibrium wage. So that means that people, workers, are very, very happy with that. So the supply of labour increases. However, firms aren't so pleased, so the demand for labour decreases. So we're going to finish up with fewer people being employed. The gap between the old equilibrium and the new demand for labour is going to be that decrease in employment. So if we're thinking of potential for government failure, people who were on low pay are now on no pay at all. In terms of unemployment in this market, well, more people are going to want to work at that higher wage. So that green line is the increase in unemployment. Again, if you want to use this, that is probably the easier line to remember on an exam paper because you're just looking at the difference between the supply and demand curves. Want to get into some evaluation that depends on factors. The first obvious one is the amount of the rise. If you set a national minimum wage below the equilibrium wage, it will have no impact on the market whatsoever. Nobody's wage will go up, nobody's wage will go down either. The higher you set it, the bigger obviously the impact on poverty, but also the more people are going to be unemployed. The second depends upon factor is the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply of labour. The bigger the elasticity, the greater the unemployment. That could be one of the reasons why younger people have a lower national minimum wage than older people. Demand in particular is likely to be more elastic, primarily because younger people are almost by definition going to be less skilled in the industry, so they'll be getting in less value to the company, and of course they'll need more training than older workers. So that's one reason why the government has a lower national minimum wage for young people. The final way of evaluating is actually looking at the facts. In other words, where caeteris is not paribus, something else is occurring at the same time. So our lovely theory suggests that unemployment should have risen after the national minimum wage was introduced. Well, that red line goes from 1999 to around about 2005, 2006, just before the credit crunch. Unemployment continued to fall. Why was that? Despite what our theory says? Well, the economy was growing at that time, and employment, labour, is a derived demand. So if the demand for products and services is growing, well, so will the demand for labour also be growing, even though there is an increase in the cost of employing that labour. So what are the advantages? Well, first of all, obviously, it's going to boost the pay of low-paid workers. It's also going to boost the pay of those just above that because they're going to be seeking compensatory pay rises. If the people just below you have got a pay rise, then you're going to want a pay rise as well. It does provide an incentive for people to move out of benefit and into work. It might also have an impact on productivity if those workers feel happy. It should reduce discrimination. BAMEs and females are more likely to be low paid. There are some macro advantages as well. It could well improve marginally the budget deficit, because as poor people get richer, as they're paid more, they're likely to move into income tax, they're going to spend more, so they're going to be paying more VAT or excise duties, while at the same time government spending is likely to reduce because the people are less poor, they're going to need less income related benefits. What about the cons? Well, according to that lovely diagram you've drawn, unemployment is likely to rise. The labour costs are going to rise, so profits are likely to be hit. Particularly, that's likely to have an impact on small business. Though the minimum wage, the concept of it, this is the lowest amount you can pay per hour, sounds incredibly straightforward. In reality, the law is horrendously complex. For example, how do you deal with workers who are paid by output piece rates rather than on time? How do you deal, for example, with people who could be employed by more than one person at the same time, for example, childminders? So to understand and implement it is actually an expensive thing itself. It's going to take up resources. What firms might do is, in order to save costs, they might toughen up on other conditions of employment, so workers might actually not be so well off. It might not actually reduce inequality, because it's based on the individual's pay per hour, and that individual may be perhaps the second earner or the third earner in a family. And normally when we measure poverty, we look at households rather than individuals. And again, on the macro side, we've said that the budget deficit might fall. Well, it might rise, because if unemployment goes up, then we're going to be paying more unemployment benefits. You could well get cost push inflation, and it will mean, of course, that we have reduced international competitiveness. A lot will depend upon our minimum wage compared to those of our major competitors. If they're roughly the same, then that won't be an important impact. So our second example of a price floor is a Scottish one from 2018. The Scottish government introduced a minimum price of alcohol, where a minimum price of 50p per unit of alcohol was set up. Reasons for that are obvious. They want to reduce alcohol consumption. They want to reduce the impacts, both private impacts on your personal health and, of course, external impacts as well. The money goes to the drink producers and the retailers. In the first year of implementation, there was a 3.6% decrease in pure alcohol, cider down much more than spirits and beer. Fortified wine also heavily hit. And you see on the right hand side there how much the unit price of alcohol actually went up, which means you could do some useful price elasticity of demand calculations. Potential negative impacts, well, the price of the product has gone up. That is likely to encourage illegal supply, so you could well find a black market emerges. Now, politically, I'm in favour of the EU. I was very much against Brexit. Similarly, economically, I think it's a bit of a disaster for the country. However, when we look at the EU Common Agricultural Policy as an example of a price floor, a guaranteed minimum price of agricultural produce, my sort of fanaticism for the EU does tend to fall just a little bit. So again, the aims of these things are usually good. In this particular case, it was a good aim. It was to protect and improve the living standards of farmers and rural communities. So they set a minimum price above the equilibrium price, so effectively it's the same diagram as the minimum wage diagram. Whereas with the minimum wage we had an excess supply that was unemployment, here we have an excess supply of agricultural produce. In order to maintain that minimum price, the government has to buy up the excess at the minimum price, so they will be paying that shaded yellow area to farmers. So what do they do with it? Well, they will have to store it. Some of it might have to be frozen, for example, beef. They might simply destroy it, or they might dump it onto world markets outside of the EU. So if we look at the pros and cons, well, a pro in terms of who benefits Obviously, farmers are going to benefit. They're going to get higher prices, higher producer surplus. Also, because they've now got a guaranteed minimum price, it makes it easier for them to plan because they're dealing with less price fluctuations. Agricultural produce tends to be subject to quite large price fluctuations because of the instability of supply and the inelasticity of both supply and demand. And of course, it means that they've got more money to invest into rural communities, or perhaps to pay their workers. But what about the negatives? Well, we've got that overproduction. When this was operating at its peak, you got food mountains, you got wine lakes that you couldn't sell. Prices higher than the equilibrium, so there's going to be less consumer surplus, so the consumer is going to be worse off, and so is the taxpayer, because they've got to pay for higher government spending, because the government has to buy it, store it, freeze it, and of course there's going to be an opportunity cost there for the government. This diagram shows how much the Common Agricultural Policy is actually costing the EU. Now remember that the EU is primarily concerned with goods and services. We are not primarily an agricultural producer. Despite that, in 1985, nearly 3/4 of the EU budget didn't go on supporting industry or developing industry. It went on the CAP, and it's still around about 30%. So they do spend an awful lot of money. That is the single biggest chunk of money that the EU spends on the Common Agricultural Policy. There will obviously be resource waste. So effectively, what the EU is saying is, okay, farmers, we want you to grow the produce, and then we are going to spend resources destroying it. Obviously, there's going to be environmental impacts there as well. Or alternatively, we're going to dump it onto world markets. Remember, dumping means you're selling cheaply, you're selling below cost onto world markets. Well, who are the natural food producers? The third and fourth world. So we're actually undercutting third and fourth world producers. So what are the alternatives? Well, one could be to subsidise rather than pay a minimum price. That still means there's an opportunity cost, and it still means there's going to be higher taxes, and it's still going to undercut the third world. Or alternatively, you could have a set-aside scheme, and again that has been done, where you pay farmers to not grow crops or raise animals on their fields. I'd rather like that. That'll be like paying me to not teach. The CAP today, they try to link it to environmental and food standards, or else they'll lose their payments. And arable set aside was removed in 2008, but it's still basically, in my view, a pretty rubbish scheme that's far too expensive. But there you go, and that's it on price floors.